From being fired for being too intimidated by the cast, to being removed from his dream film, here is the dark truth behind some A-list directors being fired, starting with Anthony Mann from Spartacus. I'm pretty sure we've all heard about this film. The American epic historical drama was directed by none other than the legendary Stanley Kubrick, but he wasn't the first choice for the movie. The project had initially gone over to another director, Anthony Mann. He was the best fit for directing the film because he'd had a lot of experience in the Western genre. But unfortunately, things went south after only a few days of shooting. The film's executive producer and star, Kirk Douglas, had a bad feeling about Mann. He thought that the original director's approach wasn't up to par, and that Anthony seemed to be almost intimidated by the cast. Douglas also thought that Mann was terrified of the scope of the project, and that it seemed too big for him. Because of this, Anthony was fired, and Kubrick was brought on instead. That's harsh, but I'm glad he was fired, because Stanley Kubrick brought the character of Spartacus to life in a way that no one else could have, even though it was pretty unfair that Mann had to go. That reminds me, remember when Richard Stanley was asked to leave the island of Dr. Moreau? You probably haven't heard of this one. This 1996 classic had a pretty troubled production. It was Richard Stanley's dream to adapt H.G. Wells' novel to the silver screen. He worked for a good few years on the project before deciding to make a deal with the company. It took some time, but he finally decided to partner up with New Line Cinema, but things didn't quite work out as planned. There were a ton of creative differences between them. On top of this, one of the stars of the production, Val Kilmer, started misbehaving on set. The studio realized that Richard had little to no control over the situation and fired him pretty much instantly. They hired John Frankenheimer in his place, but the film was a box office flop and received mainly negative reviews. Ouch, that probably hurts. Just like it did when another director was fired from the film they spent a long time working on, Brenda Chapman. All set to go down in cinematic history as Pixar's very first female director with Brave, Brenda's film was inspired by her own relationship with her daughter, and Chapman was the mastermind behind it. She worked for several years on the project. However, due to creative differences, Pixar decided to fire her and bring in Mark Andrews in her place. Yikes, that must have stung. To their credit, Pixar did credit both Brenda and Mark as directors, but the original director was devastated. I mean, the movie was literally her baby. Luckily, she was happy with the final version of the film. After she watched it, she said that it aligned with her version of the movie. At least that's good news. Although, this next movie did not have the same end in sight for its OG director. Yep, I'm talking about Exorcist: The Beginning. In case you didn't know, the horror film underwent a couple of directors, like Tom McLaughlin and John Frankenheimer, before it finally reached Paul Schrader. Both the directors had stepped away from the project for different reasons before Schrader took over.
By the sign of this holy cross, by our Lord Jesus Christ.
The prequel film The Exorcist garnered a ton of success, and so expectations were pretty high for this film. But Paul's final version did not meet the standards of the studio, Morgan Creek Productions. Schrader tried editing the material a good few times, but he failed to satisfy the studio, and just like that, he was let go. Renny Harlin was hired in his place. But this 2004 horror film turned out to be a box office failure and a critical flop that earned poor reviews. And unfortunately, this next guy was met with the same fate too, Richard Thorpe. Now this guy was brought on to replace Norman Torrig, who was heading the production of one of the greatest classics of all time, The Wizard of Oz. Released in 1939, based on the kids' novel by L. Frank Baum, this film's one of the best classics out there. But did you know that it's also pretty accidental? Even though he gave it his all, Richard could not impress the film's producer, Mervyn LeRoy. LeRoy then decided to fire the director and hired George Cukor instead, who he replaced as head of production for a little while. George acted as creative advisor until finally Victor Fleming took over the role of director, which you gotta admit was a pretty long ride. But I guess it's not all that uncommon. After all, James Cameron went through the same too. Not a lot of people would associate Cameron with the Piranha film series, but that's where he took his baby steps as a director. James was chosen to direct Piranha 2: The Spawning, Thing, which was a sequel to the original Piranha film that was released in 1978. The movie was going to be Cameron's directorial debut, but his journey with the film was complicated to say the least. After he worked on the project for a few weeks, he started having some creative differences with the producer of the film, Ovidio Assanides, who promptly fired him. Luckily, he was still credited as a director because of some contractual reasons. Still, it's pretty sad that he lost his film, just like our next guy, Ted Griffin. As the OG director of the 2005 film, rumor has it, the film starred some pretty big names, like Kevin Costner, Shirley MacLaine, Mark Ruffalo, and Jennifer Aniston. Ted seemed to be pretty proud of this film, since he'd written the screenplay as well. It was all set to be his directorial debut, but things quickly went south.
I love you.
No, don't say that. Don't you say that.
Well, did you sleep with a man who also slept with Mom and Grandma Catherine?
The project was moving on incredibly slowly, and that's not all. Ted's choices regarding the set were 0% appealing to the producers. They finally had enough and decided to chuck him out, hiring Rob Reiner instead. That must have been a difficult pill to swallow for Ted Griffin. It's not easy giving up your top film, and who would know this better than the former director of the 2018 biopic Bohemian Rhapsody, Bryan Singer. The film, which revolves around the lead singer of the band Queen, Freddie Mercury, credits Bryan Singer as the director. But get this, just mere weeks before the production was finished, Bryan was fired. In his stead, Dexter Fletcher took over and wrapped the project. Singer being fired might have been a good call though. I heard he got into a lot of conflicts with the actors and the stars on set, and his behavior wasn't all that great either. He didn't come to set a lot. For someone who was frequently absent from his job, it's almost miraculous that he was still credited as the production's director. Good for him, I guess. The same can't be said for Steven Soderbergh though. The 2011 film Moneyball, starring Jonah Hill and Brad Pitt, was originally supposed to be directed by Steven. He wanted to turn it into a semi-documentary style production, where he could integrate real-life interviews with athletes. Can you imagine a Moneyball like that? I can't, and it seems like Sony couldn't either. The studio was not happy with that approach. After a couple of weeks of back and forth and some significant creative differences, Sony ended up firing Soderbergh and hiring Bennett Miller in his place. Now, Dick Richards also knows this feeling all too well. Believe it or not, he was the first in line to spearhead the 1975 legendary movie Jaws. I know we all associate it with Steven Spielberg, but he only came in after Richards was fired. The project was going well when Dick was in charge, but one thing he did bothered the producers a lot. He kept calling the sharks whales. They decided to fire him, and the rest is history. There you have it. That's everything about the dark truth behind directors being fired.